Hey everyone, it's Angela with FoodStorageAndSurvival.com, and today we are canning meat. Today's meat for me is venison, and this is a little deer that my daughter shot, and we actually cut it up a couple of days ago, and I've got a video on how to cut up the hindquarter of a deer, and so I'll link to that here. But we cut this up, and this is the meat that I cut for bottling, for canning. You can also can any other meats. So you can can chicken or pork or beef or any other game meats, your elk, deer, moose, buffalo, whatever it is that you hunt. It can all go in bottles. And the benefit of having bottled meat is that that meat is ready to eat out of the jar. When it goes through the processor, it cooks. And it's thoroughly cooked. And then when you open the jar, your meat is ready to eat. You can heat it up if you want, or you can eat it cold. It's all good and safe. It cooks to a consistency that will shred easily, and so it's nice for like shredded chicken enchiladas, and we actually like to pull the deer and elk out of the bottle and then just kind of smush it and shred it in our fingers and put it on bread and have a sandwich. So it's so easy to use. So convenient once it's done. So we're going to show you, I'm going to walk you through how to can meat. First we'll talk about what it is that you need to get started. You're going to need some meat. Like I said, you can have any kind of meat. So we're doing deer today. You're going to need jars, and I do mine in pints. Almost forgot what size this was. I do mine in pints. A pint of meat is about a pound, and so most of your recipes aren't going to call for more than a pound of meat, even family size recipes. You can bottle this in quarts, but once you get up to quarts, that's 2 pounds of meat. That's a lot. So it will speed up your canning because you're putting more into a jar, but it will it's harder to use 2 pounds of meat at a time. So I just always put mine in pints, and that way we can use the whole jar once I open it. It's pretty easy to get through. Okay, so jars, you'll also need your rings and your lids, so your 2-piece caps for the jars. And you'll need canning or pickling salt, not the iodized salt, canning, pickling. You can get this in the salt section, usually of your store where the seasonings are. If you go to the canning section, they'll have some canning and pickling salt too, but it's usually more expensive. So if you can find it in just the salt seasoning type section of your store, you can get this, and it's fairly inexpensive. Okay, the other thing that you're going to need is a pressure canner, and you can't do this job with a water bath canner. You've got to have a steam pressure canner because meat is a low acid food. So you need a steam pressure canner. Mine's an older model. I actually got it from my grandma, inherited it. Thanks, Grandma. And but you can get one similar to mine that's a Presto brand, or you can get an all-American canner, and I tell you, that's on my list. I'm going to get one of those one of these days. But for now, I'm just using Grandma's canner because, hey, it works, and it was free. So, all right, you ready to get started? We're going to show you how to bottle meat. All right, step number 1 is to get your meat cut up. And like I said, I cut this up the other day. I go for chunks about like that. They can be a little thicker. These are just kind of the random pieces at the ends of what I was working with. So I was cutting meat for jerky, and these were the pieces that were kind of left over. And they cut them up for bottled meat. Whatever size they are, that's what they're going to be when they're done. So if you want big pieces of meat, leave your pieces big. Leave your meat in big chunks, and then when you bottle it, it'll still be big. All right, once your meat's ready to pack into the jars, then it's time to get the rest of your canning stuff ready. So this is step number 2. Wash the jars, nice and soapy hot water. Get them clean. If you can run them through the dishwasher, that's even better. Our dishwasher's broken right now, so I just wash mine hot soapy water and we're good. Okay, get your canner ready on the stove. Okay. And put about 2 inches of water in it. Okay, with the rack in the bottom of the canner. And that just keeps your jars off the bottom of the canner and keeps them from getting too hot. All right, next thing is getting your lids ready. So I put them in a pot of hot water on the stove and put them on low so that it softens up the rubber part on the bottom side of the lids. So then they'll be ready to use. One more note on the canner setup. I did not turn on the heat on the canner yet because I did put hot water in there, but I'm going to be packing these jars full of the meat that I've had in the refrigerator. And so even though I'm adding hot water to the jars with the meat is so cold that hot water, those jars are not going to be hot when they go into the canner. And if you put coldish jars into hot water, you're going to bust the bottoms out of your jars and lose all your meat. And so I'm not going to do that. I put the hot water in the canner and I did not turn it on, and that way I'll be able to put these jars in without having the heat difference with the kind of cold meat that's going in and into the hot water. All right, next step is to pack the meat into the jars. And so, like I said, I have pint jars, and I'm just going to pack the meat into it. Just put them in the jars, and you can smush it in there fairly snug. You want it full of meat. Some people, when they do this, don't add any water. They just pack their meat in really tight and then don't add water, and the meat juices will kind of make liquid in the jar even without water. I always add water just because I like mine to be covered when it's done all the way to the top with the juice, and that just helps add a little bit of volume to the juice, and it also gives you just a little broth when you're done. So most of my recipes that I make using the bottled meat, I use the meat and the juice right out of the jar. Okay, so you gotta see it's packed in there nice and tight. There's a few spots where I've got air holes. That's totally okay, but I've packed it up to about an inch headspace. Can you see that? Okay, inch headspace. So after I pack the jar full, then I put in, a half a teaspoon of salt in each jar. Okay. We'll pack all the jars like that, and then we'll be ready for the next step. Okay, next step is to add the water to the jars. So you can cook your water in a pot on the stove to get it really hot. My tap water is super hot, like it'll burn you. So I just use my tap water out of my sink. Probably cheating, I don't know. And this give it enough water that it's going to end up at that same about an inch of headspace after you get the bubbles out. So after you put some water in, you want to squish the meat around and get your bubbles out and let the water get down to the bottom. You don't want to use a metal thing here like Grandma might have used a knife or something, but you don't want to stick a knife in your jars because that can scrape the glass and damage your glass. Okay, now if you free your bubbles and end up with not enough water, then you just add just a little bit more water. Okay, so that your meat's covered and you still got about an inch of headspace. So I'm using a wooden spoon, the back end of a wooden spoon, to free my bubbles. I've also used chopsticks, but right now all my chopsticks have been commandeered by the children and turned into wands. Thank you, Harry Potter. So I don't have any chopsticks that I can find, but I do have the end of a wooden spoon, so that's what I'm using to free my bubbles. There's also a commercial product called a bubble freer that is a plastic piece that Ball makes, and you can use that to free your bubbles, but it's one more thing in my kitchen when I can just use a chopstick if I can find one. Okay, next step after you've got water in all of your jars is to wipe off the rims to make sure that there's no meat juice or little bits of meat or salt or whatever on the rim that's going to cause a bad seal. And then we're going to put the lids on the jars. So we'll wipe them all off. Okay, and I have 9 jars. My canner's going to hold 9, so I have 9 of them ready. All right, and get your hot lid and screw your lid on with the ring. And you want it just finger tight, like the rest of your canning, usual canning procedure, just as tight as you get it with your fingers. And then place it into your canner And once you've got your canner full of those jars, then you are ready to start canning. All right, now we have the jars in the canner, and we're going to put the lid on the canner and start heating it up. So the lid goes on, my lid goes on, and it's got a little open mark, and then I twist it and it's locked shut. Yours will vary by the manufacturer, so make sure that you've got it in the closed position so that it can start building pressure. And you want to heat it, turn your heat up on your stove, and heat it until the steam's coming out the vent pipe, and then when it's venting, you can put the little pressure rocker, what is this thing called? Can't remember. Anyway, you put this little heavy weighted gauge piece on there. All right, mine has a dial gauge, yours may or may not. It also has this weighted gauge, and that's going to help build up the pressure. Now, I'm not putting it on yet, I was just showing you where it went. It's okay, no worries. Okay, once it is steaming, and once we get that vent pipe with the rocker on it, then I'm going to watch the pressure. And these meats, the meats have to process at pressure for 75 minutes. So yeah, that's an hour and 15 minutes. Okay, when I say at pressure, let's just explain what that means real quick. You can't start your canning time until your canner has reached pressure. And pressure is going to be a little bit different depending on where you live. At sea level, it's about 10 pounds of pressure. Where I live at, or above sea level, and it's close to 15 pounds of pressure. So in my book, Food Storage for Self-Sufficiency and Survival, you can get this on Amazon, there's a chapter on preserving your own food, and in there is a chart on canning above sea level. So you can kind of see where you're at, your altitude, and how much pressure you need to be canning at. Okay, so I'm clear over here where I'm almost to this one, the 14. And I just can at 15 because that is where my weighted gauge, let me get it real quick, this little weighted gauge rocks on my canner when it's on the vent pipe, and this hits about 15, that's when this rocks. And then I can just listen, and I know that I'm at the right pressure as I go about whatever else I'm doing, because it's going okay, we'll have sound effects, but I'll show you later when it's actually happening. I'll show you that. Okay, so for right now, we don't want to put the weighted gauge on. We're just going to heat this up, let it start venting, and then we'll put it on and let the pressure start building. Okay. All right, we turned on the heat on the canner, put the lid on, it built up heat until it was steaming out the vent, and then put the rocker onto the vent, and now it is has built up pressure, and it's rocking, and you can hear that. It sounds exactly like I said earlier, right? So that's the sound, and it actually on mine it looks like it's rocking about 16 pounds of pressure, which isn't a big deal. Like I said, I'm supposed to be canning at about 14, so a couple extra pounds of pressure is not going to hurt it at all. So as soon as that started rocking, when I got up to pressure, then I set my timer, and so now I'm just going to wait until it's done. And keep an eye on your stove and keep an eye on your pressure gauge so that you can regulate the temperature. You can turn it up or turn it down to keep it at pressure. It's got to be at least at your pressure for the entire 75 minutes. So just keep an eye on that as you're canning, and we'll check back on in with this when the timer's done. All right, we've had our canner at pressure for the whole 75 minutes canning this meat, and now the timer's beeped. So we need to shut it off and let the pressure drop. So on a gas stove, you can just shut it off and let it sit right there because that took the heat away. On an electric stove, you're going to want to heft it off of the burner and onto a cool burner just so that it can get off of the heat and cool down a little quicker. All right, at this point, we don't want to mess with the rocker or the lid or anything. We're just going to let that pressure drop. And once it's all dropped down, then we can take the lid off and get our jars out. All right, last step, your canner's cooled down, pressure's down to 0. You can take your rocker off and open the canner up. and get your jars out. Now, I actually left mine here for a few hours this afternoon when I was doing other mom duties, and that's totally okay. It works out fine. Normally I'd grab these with my jar lifter, but just going to use my hot pad right now because they're really not that hot. Like I said, they've been sitting here for a little longer than I normally would have left them. Okay, so there is your bottled meat. Not real pretty, but really useful. So once you take them out of the canner, set them out on a rack to cool and let them cool down, and the lids will seal. Like I said, these have already been sitting in the canner cooling, so all of my lids are popped down already. We're just going to pull them out of here and have bottled meat that we can put on the shelf. All right, thanks for joining me today. It's Angela, Food Storage and Survival.com.